Okay, gearbox is rebuilt, engine set to get the transmission back onto, so before we do that, now we've got to pay attention to the clutch. And this is the release bearing carrier in a Triumph Spitfire gearbox. It's going to be basically the same throughout the entire Spitfire range. The main difference you're going to see is that the release bearing itself will be a little bit different. This is an early one, it's a different style of clutch, but it fits onto the carrier the same way. So to take it fully apart, you see that the carrier kind of slides back and forth in these two pins, and that way what's happening here is we've got a rod on the back. This is pushed by the slave cylinder. It's actually pressed in this direction with the clutch being on this side. There's a clutch pin that we drove out earlier. That goes in there. It's a tight fit. And what's happening is it's pushing it forward, which is putting pressure on the clutch when you step on the pedal. And that's why this is allowed to pivot a little bit, because as it moves forward it keeps it flat. So those pins are allowed to move, but we need to get them out so we can properly clean everything. I guess you don't have to get it out, you can just use a gear puller. But here's what we're going to do. We've got a punch. We're going to take out a roll pin here and one on the other side. Those pins can come out. We can take out the carrier and we can get the release bearing off. Now to do that, you can use a number of different things. We've just got a socket here and a gear puller, and we're just going to pull this straight off. I've got a replacement one all set up, and so that's basically it. That's all you need. A wrench, obviously, to operate your gear puller, and let's get to work. Screwdriver comes in handy here. There we go. It is the same process, and we're not going to do it, but there is a pin that is held in here, and you can see that it's peened over on the casting here. But if you were to punch out this pin, then you can take out the operating rod, I guess we'll call it. And you probably don't need to do that, but the only reason you would need to is if you're not getting enough travel and you find out that this is worn for some reason. I haven't seen that, but if you get a new piece and you compare it, it's a little bit longer, you might get a little bit more travel on the clutch. All of this has to be in good operating order, so you want to make sure that that pin isn't worn on the inside. Although taking it out, you take a risk of damaging the carrier. So if you're not having clutch trouble, probably leave this alone. I am not. But you can take that further apart if you need to. This is good enough for our purposes. It's clean, and that's what we want. So, there's There's our release bearing we need to get off. There's the pin, we'll just set that aside. I should point out that doing this is damaging the bearing, so once you take it off, don't put it back on. Unless you want to have to pull the gearbox over again. Okay, here's our old bearing and the new one, and never reuse an old bearing. Once that comes off, you've already put some forces on it, so don't put it back on. But you want to make sure that the new one is the same size, that it's going to be a press fit when it goes on, that it's not just going to slide off. And I have this, this is for pressing bearings on. It's a piece of plastic, and if you have a press like I do, you can put this in the press, just pump it down basically until it's snug. If you don't, you can use a vise. That works just fine for this application anyway. Just make sure that it's not going on at an angle. You want it to be straight as possible. And then once it's on, and you're good to go. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll start reassembling this. Here we are with the new bearing on. And then this is going to go back together exactly the same way that it came apart. So we can get in one of these pins. So do it from the inside here. You don't want to go too hard on this because you will crack this. This is just an aluminum casting. Make sure it's going through, and I'm going to put it over here so it's a little bit less noise. There we go. But again, you should just be tapping it in. If you're going too hard, then you have the risk that you're going to break it. So before you put the other one in, get your carrier in place. There you have it. New release bearing. Everything moves nice and smooth. It's quiet. And we're ready to reassemble this in our gearbox. Okay, here we are at the bell housing, and I'm going to give you the concept of what we're going to do, but I've just discovered that I need to order a part. This pin fits in through the top of the gearbox, or I guess from the bottom, either direction really, and it's going to go in there, okay? And that is what this is going to slide on. It is a tight fit on the carrier, and then what's happening is you're going to have it in place like that. Okay, to get this out, we drove out that pin. We're going to be putting it back in, and then when you press on the clutch, it moves the whole assembly forward and back. That's why you need these pins to allow the release bearing carrier to pivot a little bit as it moves back and forth. And so that's the concept. Now, Triumph Spitfires have a nasty habit of not having enough clutch travel, and you need to make sure that the whole system is in good shape. So that includes the master cylinder, all the lines, the slave cylinder, all of those have to be working. This rod on the end of the carrier, you need that to be in good shape and not super worn. The release bearing has to be in good shape. It has to be a tight fit on the inside of the carrier here on this pin. And I don't have clutch problems on this car, but if you look carefully, I wonder if you can see that. If you look closely on this, you can see that it's worn. You could see groove marks, and you could easily feel that with your finger. And so in theory, that means that this pin would be able to travel a little bit farther back and forth, so there's going to be a little bit of play. It's not going to fall out, it's still tight in the carrier, but as it sits in here, there's going to be a little bit of play. It was not causing a problem yet, but it could. Pieces like this, if it's worn, you've got the gearbox out of the car, get a replacement, make sure it's the right part, and then toss that. In addition to the pin, the other part that you want to pay attention to, there's a couple of bushings in here. You can see the one at the bottom, there's another one at the top. And these can also wear. And so you want to take your pin, which we know the pin is worn, but if you have excessive play here, you can replace those bushings as well. You can get a replacement probably at a hardware store, to be honest with you, and just make sure that it's a reasonable fit and that you don't have excessive play with the pin. What will happen is a combination of things. So we talked about how we have wear on the pin itself. You can see that on the pin there. It's pretty dramatic, actually. And then you can also have wear on these bearing surfaces. And if you have wear on both of those, that's when you end up with excessive play here. It moves back and forth a bit more than it should, and you will end up with a clutch that does not have enough travel, which is going to lead to problems shifting into gear. So if you can't get into first, if you have the clutch in but the car is still moving, all of those things are going to be attributed to tiny things like this that you didn't pay attention to during the rebuild, or that somebody else didn't. So if you've got it apart this far, make sure that it's right going back together. Okay, so we've got some bearing surfaces. There is your pin, that gets worn. These are the bearings that we just took out of the gearbox bell housing. Those can wear. And then I believe there's another one inside here. Yeah, it looks like there is. And so that's another one that you can replace. If the fit isn't tight, you want to make sure that you get that one too. So on some cars that may just fall out. On mine it's in there pretty good, so I'm not too concerned with it. But I definitely want to get a new pin, and I'm going to replace these since they're already out. Okay, to get this back together, first you want to add a little bit of grease. I use white lithium grease. You don't want anything that's going to be too much, because then it's going to get on the clutch disc surfaces, but you want a little bit of lubricant there and something that's going to stay put. And get your assembly in place here. Make sure it slides back and forth easily. And get your pin in place. Just tap it down gently. I want this to be kind of centered. But if not perfectly centered, air a little bit towards the top so in case it ever slides down. Notice I'm using a pretty light hammer. And it would appear we've got everything where it needs to be. So, yeah, I think we're good to go. Okay guys, that's pretty much it. The gearbox is all set. It's ready to go back in the car. Of course, we need to make sure that we've got our pressure plate and clutch disc on the back of the engine, but outside of that, that's as far as we can go with the gearbox. So if you have any questions, like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.